Would you believe that a head nurse was handcuffed in the middle of a supermarket just because she wanted to buy heart medication, just because of the color of her skin? She was treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of a crowd, while there was no evidence other than the suspicious eyes of a white manager and two racist police officers. But they didn't know the person they were humiliating was the mother of a legendary former federal agent. And when he appeared, the entire system bowed its head. This is not just a story about a wrongful arrest. This is a wake-up call for all of America. This is the moment when injustice, which seemed to have quietly prevailed, was overthrown by an old mother and the fire of justice in her heart. You won't be able to take your eyes off this story. An incident that seemed to have been buried became the spark for an unprecedented movement. If you believe that justice must be served, like, share, and subscribe to our channel to spread the truth. Elise Monroe, 53, head nurse at Memorial Hospital, had just finished a grueling double shift, 14 hours on her feet, tending to failing lungs, soothing, shaking hands, coaxing life into bodies too close to letting go. She didn't feel heroic. She just felt tired. Bone deep, tired. The kind that seeps into her spine and beats behind her eyes. Her car, an old gray sedan with an old engine and cracked dashboard, rolled into the mall parking lot. She always parked under the flickering streetlights, half out of habit, half out of superstition. Her white surgical scrubs had lost their shape, clinging to her like an old memory. Her shoes ached inside and out, but she walked as she always did, straight, steady, calm. It was the nurse's walk. You learn that after many nights of being strong for others. She entered the pharmacy quietly, as she always did, just to stop on the way home, just one more thing before she could collapse. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. The store was nearly empty, save for a teenage clerk behind the counter, absently thumbing through his phone. Elise offered a soft smile, the kind you give to strangers to remind them you're human. "Good evening," she said, and handed over her ID, her insurance card, and the familiar paper prescription for her blood pressure medication. The clerk didn't look up for more than a second, just nodded vaguely, and began clicking at the keyboard with the slow rhythm of someone who didn't want to be there. She waited, one foot to the other. The seconds stretched. The boy frowned at the screen, leaned in, then mumbled something over his shoulder toward the back of the store. A woman appeared, blonde, mid-40s, tight face. Manager, clearly, the kind of expression that made everything feel like a problem. She looked at the computer, then at Elise. Then again, her lips pressed thin. She typed something. Spoke softly to the clerk. Elise couldn't hear the words, but she felt them, sharp, quiet syllables, carrying suspicion like a scent in the air. The atmosphere shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A weight settled in Elise's chest. Not fear. She had known fear in emergency rooms, in waiting rooms, in the beep of flatlined monitors. This was different. This was the slow, sour stink of being watched like you don't belong. It was something every black woman learns to detect early in life, not from noise, but from stillness. From the way a room seems to tilt just slightly when people decide you're a problem before you say a word. The manager stepped forward. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said with the kind of smile that isn't a smile. "There seems to be an issue with your prescription." Elise raised an eyebrow calmly. "What kind of issue? The account information doesn't match. We can't fill it tonight." Elise's voice remained level. "I've picked up this same medication here for years. Nothing's changed. Please, double-check." The woman stiffened. Her shoulders squared her expression. "Set. I'm going to have to ask you to wait here." Then the sentence came dry and soft, like a match being struck. "We've contacted the authorities." For a moment, Elise thought she misheard. She blinked. The authorities. The clerk behind the counter looked like he wanted to melt into the linoleum. His eyes stayed glued to the register. The manager's chin lifted slightly. That familiar posture. The posture of someone who's already decided who's guilty. Elise took a breath. Slowly, purposefully. She'd learned in trauma rooms how to breathe through panic. How to keep her face calm when parents screamed, or when doctors barked orders over a fading heartbeat. But this wasn't clinical. This was older, uglier, the kind of cold judgment that isn't about who you are, but what they see when they look at you. Outside, a distant siren wailed. Elise stood still. She could have left. She could have demanded her paperwork and walked out. But that would have looked like guilt. And she was tired, yes, but not ashamed, so she stayed. She didn't flinch when the door chimed and 2 officers stepped into the pharmacy minutes later, both white, one tall and square-shouldered with a buzz cut and the kind of smirk that never meant anything good. The other younger, lanky, less sure of himself. They didn't approach the counter like investigators. They approached like men who already had their answers. "That's her!" The manager hissed, her voice sharp. "Tried to pick up medication fraudulently. I think she's using someone else's insurance." The taller officer didn't even look at the documents, didn't ask a single question. He just turned toward Elise and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside." Elise stood tall, her voice quiet but clear. "I haven't done anything wrong." The younger officer shifted on his feet, uncomfortable, but silent. The manager folded her arms, watching like she'd won something. The officer's hand moved to his belt. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said. From the corner of her eye, Elise saw a customer raise a phone, begin filming. Good still. Her chest burned with shame, with the bitter heat of rage wrapped in exhaustion. She had done nothing wrong. She had given everything years of service nights with no sleep holidays, spent saving lives. And still here she was, a suspect, a threat because of the color of her skin. She raised her hand, holding up her ID, her insurance card, her prescription. "I have everything right here," she said evenly. "Everything matches." The officer barely glanced. "Step outside." When she didn't move quickly enough, he stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. Gasps echoed through the store. Elise didn't resist. She didn't give them what they wanted. She kept her head high. The metal cuffs bit into her skin, cold, sharp, humiliating. The manager smiled faintly. Elise saw it. She didn't look away. She met the officer's eyes, and her voice didn't tremble. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The door slammed shut behind her, and somewhere deep beneath the humiliation, something colder began to burn. They didn't know who she was, not yet, but they would. The siren was not loud, but it seemed to cut a cold rift in the heart of the city, where peace was now an illusion. Elise Monroe did not turn around when the red and blue lights flashed from the pharmacy window. She stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, her back straight, her eyes staring into space as if awaiting a fateful verdict. But even in that moment, she still held on to the most precious thing, her dignity. 2 policemen entered. Both were white. The first was large, with a powerful gait, and a gaze that seemed to pierce anyone who got in his way. His lips curved slightly, not a polite smile, but the smirk of someone accustomed to punishing. The second was younger, stepping behind his hands, clutching his belt, his eyes uncertain, like a trainee soldier, not ready for what he was about to do. The manager, blonde hair neatly tied, cold face, stepped forward to greet him. Her voice suddenly became falsely humble. She said, lowering her voice, but clearly she was trying to get drugs with invalid paperwork. "I suspect insurance fraud." No one asked Elise a question. No one asked for clarification. No paperwork was checked. Just the tall cop walked toward Elise like a judge who had pronounced his sentence before the defendant had even opened his mouth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with contempt. I need you to come out with us. Elise did not flinch. I have done nothing wrong. The young cop glanced at her. He saw something in Elise's eyes. The weariness not of the body, but of a soul too accustomed to the humiliation of being wrongly accused. But he said nothing, did not intervene. She didn't know his name, but she would remember that look later, the timid look knowing it was wrong but not brave enough to stop. And it was that look that saddened her more than the accusation. We can do this the easy way, or the hard way. The older cop set his hand already on his gun. Elise took a deep breath. A woman stepped back, pulling her young son away. A man standing near the cold medicine cabinet quietly pulled out his phone and started recording. Elise recognized it, a small light in the darkness. She wasn't completely alone. She held out her papers, ID, insurance card, doctor's prescription. I have everything in order, she said, her voice even and steady. Get out, he interrupted, not looking at the papers. She didn't move right away, and then the rough hand closed around her wrist. The cold metal slid into her skin, biting like claws. Each click of the handcuffs rang out like a gunshot in her heart. Not killing her, but slowly killing the good she believed in. No one stopped her. No one asked any questions. The young cop turned away. The manager smiled faintly. Elise was escorted out of the pharmacy amid curious, concerned, and, worst of all, indifferent looks. Stepping outside, the night wind caressed her face like a cold pat on the shoulder. The flashing police lights seemed to cast two colors on her guilt and shame. When pushed into the back seat, Elise did not resist, not because she was resigned, but because she knew. If she fought back, she would become the basis for a fabricated report, a cut-up videotape, a name lost in statistics. She had helped people breathe again, saved patients from the brink of death, stayed up all night, sewing up torn bodies. And now she herself, in her faded nurse's uniform, the smell of antiseptic still lingering, was being treated like a criminal in the middle of the city. In the car, the two policemen talked as if she were a commodity. You must be tired tonight, the older one said, his voice casual. Another scam. I wonder why we thought we could fool everyone. Elise listened to every word. She didn't respond. But the handcuffed hands behind her were clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. The city of Savannah passed by in slow motion through the car window. The places she had once called familiar receded, becoming silent witnesses to something black people had endured for far too long. The assumption of guilt. At the station, everything was done as if she were a professional con artist. Name, age, race. Only the black box was marked in bold, as if it were the only information that mattered. Photograph hand pressed into the fingerprint scanner. That hand that had cradled the head of a feverish child, that had held the hand of a dying person, now rolled like an inanimate object. Elise stared silently at the inked finger. She didn't think about the humiliation. She thought about the times she'd washed blood off the hands of patients, and this was dirtier. As she walked down the cold hallway to her cell, she heard whispers. What did she do? I heard about forgery. Yeah, I knew it. That faces a problem. Elise didn't respond. She'd heard those words 1,000 times. In the eyes, in the attitudes, in the sighs of uniformed men who didn't understand what justice was. The cell door slammed shut behind her. She sat down on the icy metal bench. She looked down at her wrist. 2 red lines were clearly visible, like the marks of an unspoken sentence. But she knew what they didn't, that the video was being shared, that someone had seen it. That justice, however slow-weary, was finding its way, and somewhere, a name was about to be mentioned. Someone they never thought would intervene. A storm was brewing, and this time, Elise wasn't alone. In the cold steel cell, Elise sat still on the metal bench, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her knees. She didn't stir, didn't ask, didn't beg. Every movement exuded the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting in the storm. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling flickered, buzzing like insects against walls in the rainy season. In that silence, something moved, something invisible, a change in the air. She felt it. The beats of time began to slow, not out of fear, but because something was about to happen. Outside the cell, the Savannah police station operated as it did every night. Cold coffee in paper cups, languid voices over walkie-talkies, the click of boots on the old tile floor. But something had changed. The glances were avoided. The sentences were short. No one mentioned the name Elise Monroe, but everyone was thinking about it. At the end of the hall, Officer David Whitaker, the younger leaner, with the lost eyes from the pharmacy, sat silently in the security room. His fingers kept rubbing at the ink stains on his desk, as if to erase the guilt that was clinging to him. His eyes glanced toward the surveillance camera screen, where Elise was still sitting, unmoving like a living stone. Her gaze, even through the screen, made him breathless. He remembered the moment the woman was handcuffed. No screaming, no crying, just looking a look that pierced the soul, asking, "When will you be ashamed?" It was exactly 9:42 p.m. The landline on the central desk rang for a long time, a sound that stretched like a knife cutting into the night. The officer on duty looked up slightly annoyed, but when he saw the call light from Washington, he blinked momentarily, confused, and picked up. "Savannah PD," he said, trying to keep his voice even. A few seconds later, his expression changed. Yes, she's here." A beat of silence. "Right away, sir." He put the receiver down slowly, as if he'd just heard something more than he could process. The sound of a fist pounding on the desk came from the next room, D.C. "Now," Chief Coleman's voice thundered. He walked out of the office, his face tense, both confused and angry. "Tell them to call those lawyers," he growled. "I'm not going to let desk jockeys interfere with my work." But he didn't know. The storm was over. A few minutes later, a group of people entered through the front door. No noise, no fanfare, but the momentum was like a storm. Two men in dark suits with listening devices in their ears walked straight into the police station without even saying hello. Behind them was a man with silver hair, a straight back, eyes that looked like he had seen through thousands of false reports in his career. Elise felt the first moment those footsteps hit the tiled floor of the hallway. Something in her chest expanded. A soft breath blew through the cell like a whisper. "You are not alone." Outside, Officer Coleman stood up when he recognized the person approaching. "Who are you?" "This is a restricted area," he said, trying to keep his face stoic. The man didn't look at him. He just looked straight at the officer on duty. "My name is Isaac Monroe, former executive director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Southeast, now a senior advisor to the Department of Justice." Silence. All movement in the room seemed to stop. A few officers stood up reflexively. The rest held their breaths. "And the person you have in custody?" Isaac continued, his voice as steady as cold iron, "is my daughter." The words were like a thunderclap that shattered the night sky. Coleman stammered, We were just following procedure. There was a report of fraud." Isaac interrupted, not bothering to raise his voice. "A report without verification. A warrant without evidence. Detaining a citizen with a clear identity. Medical records. Valid insurance card, without even checking the database." Each question was a slash. Each word a denial of the right to defend oneself. "Sir!" I don't think Whitaker stepped forward, his voice low. Isaac looked directly at him. "Did you look at her?" Whitaker didn't answer. "Did you see her eyes?" he asked again. "The eyes of a person you degraded, locked up, denigrated because of the color of her skin." The officer lowered his head. His face was red, but he remained silent. Isaac turned to the federal agent beside him. "Open the cell. Immediately." A set of keys was handed over. Elise was handed out in silence, no one daring to look directly at her, no one daring to speak. She stood before her father. Elise, still in white, with red marks on her wrists, but there was something more in her eyes now. A warning. "A fire. Let's go," Isaac said, his voice softer. But before he turned away, he looked at the entire police station and left a short sentence. "The call from the Justice Department is the first warning. Don't need a second." The day after Elise Monroe was released from her cell, the Savannah police station was no longer the quiet place it had been. No one spoke, but the air had changed. It was thick. suffocating. It was as if the entire building was keeping a secret so big that no one dared to speak, but everyone knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Chief Officer Coleman was so nervous that the veins in his temples bulged. He paced the office, making phone calls. The Justice Department can't just interfere. This is local. This is my jurisdiction. But the voices on the other end of the line were cold, terse. No one above him wanted to stand with him anymore. And worse, someone was sharing information. In another corner of the station, Officer David Whitaker sat in the break room, his head in his hands, his eyes dull. He hadn't slept last night. The scene of Elise being handcuffed led away with the entire pharmacy. Watching it kept replaying in his mind like a movie on rewind. He had thought he was just doing the job. But yesterday, he had a horrifying realization he was part of the mistake. He returned home the next morning to find his sister a medical student, studying. Watching her intently take notes on cardiology, he couldn't help but think, what if one day she were in Elise's situation? Could he live with himself? At 9 a.m., the internal email vibrated. An anonymous message. The subject line was simple, hallway. Cam number 4, evening of the 13th. No explanation, no claim of responsibility, just an internal link. Whitaker clicked. The image appeared clear Elise, with all her papers in order, standing up straight, not resisting at all. The manager, whispered to the chief officer, Coleman, didn't check the information, didn't ask, didn't confirm, just walked up handcuffed. Elise, no reason, no evidence, not necessary. Whitaker stared at the screen. He couldn't sit still anymore. He stood up, walked out of the room, ignoring the suspicious eyes of his colleagues gathered around him. He knew what he had to do. That afternoon, at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of Savannah, a man sat in a secluded corner. It was Marcus Dean, a famous civil rights lawyer. And today, he had received a strange message from an anonymous source. I have internal documents on the arrest of Elise Monroe. I will give them to you, but do not reveal my identity. When Marcus opened the attachment, he knew this was not evidence. This was a bomb. That evening, in an emergency meeting between the legal team and the Justice Department, the video was shown on a large screen. No one spoke. There was only the sound of heavy breathing. The supervisor from Washington quietly stood up, pulled out his phone, and said simply, "Activate a full investigation, including internal affairs, and query all video devices for the past 30 days. Meanwhile, in Savannah, rumors began to spread. An internal affairs officer leaked the video. Other security camera videos were requested. Clips that had previously been lost resurfaced. One showed Officer Coleman pushing a young black man against a wall because he was not carrying an ID. Another showed Whitaker's partner Miller threatening a Latina woman with a baton for asking why she had been stopped. The truth began to leak out like a leak in a dam, and no one could stop it. Meanwhile, a video from a pharmacy customer shot on a phone began circulating on social media. Elise, looking tired but determined, was handcuffed for no reason. The hashtag justice. 4. Elise started trending on Twitter. Local news sites picked it up. CNN and MSNBC took notice. A group of law school students held a public workshop. When the law is broken, where does civic responsibility begin? They hung a banner, "Elise is not alone." At the police station, the atmosphere was almost oppressive. One officer withdrew his resignation. Another applied for a transfer. A white female officer emailed a federal investigator. But there were still people like Coleman clinging to power, like panicked animals. "Do they think they can take over a station?" he growled. Miller didn't answer, because for the first time, he wasn't sure. There was a knock on the door. The federal agent walked in. The camera records for the past 3 months. Now, no verification, no editing. or you know the consequences. This time, no one dared to argue. Elise sat alone in her small apartment playing the video the anonymous sender had sent her. She saw herself being handcuffed, being wheeled away. From a camera angle she had never seen before, pain welled up, but not from humiliation. It was because she had become so used to it. And now things had gone too far. Her father, Isaac Monroe, sat beside her saying nothing. Finally, he asked, "Are you scared?" Elise looked straight at him. "I'm not scared. I'm angry." "Did you see this when you were in the FBI?" she asked. Isaac sighed. "Yes, but there was no social media, no cameras on every corner. Now we have light, and that light is starting to shine through." A middle-aged black man appears on live stream, recounting how Coleman beat him 20 years ago. A Latina woman shares a podcast about being arrested by Miller in front of her children. Elise watches silently, nodding. "I'm not the first, but I'll be the last to be silent." She gets a call. "Ms. Monroe." Her voice trembles slightly. "I sent the first video. I can't stay silent anymore." Elise is silent. The other person continues. "I didn't think you would be treated like this. I didn't think they would be. So quick." "What's your name?" Elise asks. "I can't say." The other person breathes, but I'll keep sending more. In the Savannah mayor's office, an internal meeting is taking place. The representative of the Department of Justice snarls this is no longer a local issue. At a bus stop near the city center, graffiti appeared Elise, in a white shirt, her arms raised high with the words, "She's still standing." Elise knew. What was coming was not the end. It was the beginning. A truth was breaking out. And this time, no one could force it back into silence. The light of truth, once it shines, can no longer be hidden. And in Savannah, that light is spreading, penetrating the dark corners of a system that many once believed impenetrable. That day, Elise Monroe stepped out of her house in a simple white blouse, her face calm, but her eyes sharp. She was no longer the woman who had been arrested at the pharmacy. She was now an icon, even though she had never wanted to be one. And today she had agreed to participate in a press conference with leading civil rights lawyers and representatives of the Justice Department. The press conference room was packed. Reporters crowded in microphones pointed at the speaker's table. Marcus Dean sat next to Elise, breathing lightly before speaking. "We have evidence of a series of civil rights violations that spanned more than a decade in Savannah. Today, we are going to release the first part of that file." The projector turned on, an old video appeared. The image was blurry, but the voice was clear. It was Coleman. He laughed loudly as he described disciplining a stubborn young man by locking him up for 3 days without reason. His laughter echoed through the speakers, arrogant and emotionless. The air in the auditorium froze. A female reporter pulled out her headphones, silently wiping away tears. Another turned to her colleague and whispered, "There's no way to deny it anymore." Meanwhile, at the Savannah Police Department headquarters, federal agents were already working. Servers were sealed, cameras had their hard drives removed, dozens of boxes of documents were sealed with labels that read, "Federated for investigation. No personal use." Chief Coleman stood at his desk watching the agents pass by like wolves tearing apart his territory. But this time, he had no one by his side. Miller, a longtime associate, had been questioned for 4 hours this morning. He emerged from the interrogation room with a blank stare. No defenses left. An inside source reported that Miller, pressured by copies of text messages, clips, and complaints, had agreed to cooperate. He provided the names of people who had covered up wrongdoing, signed false reports, or tampered with cameras. The list was long, very long, and one name on it, and it shocked the city, was Deputy Chief Alan Greaves. Once considered a model for reform, it turned out he had personally destroyed dozens of internal files to protect problematic colleagues. The news exploded like a bomb. On local news, the screen read in red, "Breaking Savannah. Deputy Chief under criminal investigation. Below it was a picture of Elise, head held high, walking out of a press conference to applause from the people waiting outside. That same day, a peaceful protest took place in front of City Hall. People carried signs, "Justice for Elise, clean the system. We don't forget, and we don't forgive." Elise didn't speak. She just stood there silent in the crowd, holding the hand of an old man who had been beaten years ago, who had written to her the day before, saying, "You make me believe in justice again." That evening, at a small cafe, Marcus Dean opened a thick file in front of Elise and Isaac. We found an old notebook of a retired officer. He had written down the times he had been asked to correct his records. There were signatures from Greaves and Coleman. Isaac mused. They used to think their power was inviolable, but now their masks are falling off one by one. Elise nodded. We need to keep going. Not just for me, for all the people who have never been told. The next morning, the Justice Department announced that it had officially expanded its investigation to neighboring police departments. Cities that had sheltered errant officers were now caught in the storm. At Savannah Community Radio, Elise took the stage. She spoke slowly and clearly. Justice doesn't happen overnight. It has to be earned one story at a time, one piece of evidence at a time, one drop of courage at a time. And I'm not the only one standing up. I'm just one voice in a growing chorus. Viewers called into the station. A man cried on the air. My daughter was pulled over and insulted because of her sunburned hair. Thank you, Elise, for not being silent. An elderly woman called, I am 72 years old. I have witnessed the period of blatant racism. I thought things were better. But today, I see it has only changed form. But thanks to you, I see hope. The broadcast ended with hundreds of messages of thanks, sharing encouragement. That night, Elise sat in front of her window, the streetlights reflecting on her serious but peaceful face. She took out her phone, received a message from an unknown number. Don't stop. Someone is watching your every move, and they are afraid. Elise smiled. Not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who knows she is on the right path. Even if the path is full of thorns, the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, always has a way of coming back. And when it comes back, it doesn't come alone. It brings anger, faith, and hope. Elise Monroe, the woman handcuffed in a small pharmacy, has now become the first wave of a movement that no one can stop anymore. And the masks, they are falling. One, then another. That morning, the sunlight in Savannah was no longer the usual light. It was bright and fierce, as if the sky itself were witnessing a historic change. Elise Monroe woke earlier than usual. She couldn't sleep. Not because of anxiety, but because she sensed something was coming. Something bigger than she could have imagined. Today was the day she met new companions, former victims. Voices once silenced people who had suffered silently for years. Marcus Dean had invited her to a secret meeting at a small suburban church where a once-forgotten community was quietly growing. When Elise walked in, dozens of eyes turned to her. Not pity, but expectation. A young woman in her early 20s stood up first. I'm Kiara, and I was once beaten up after asking why I was stopped in the middle of the street. Her voice was shaky, but her eyes were firm. Then a man in his late 80s told of being forced to confess to a theft while picking up recycling cans. Then a couple who lost their child when law enforcement refused to provide timely medical assistance. Each had a different story, a different pain, but they all shared a common desire: justice. Elise listened quietly. She didn't lecture, didn't preach. She just nodded occasionally, took notes, and when everyone was done, she stood up. We have an opportunity that few people have had before to form a coalition, not just to sue, but to change, from the ground up. The eyes that looked at her were now determined. A woman in glasses, a former teacher, nodded vigorously. We could form a people's committee. An independent monitoring group. I'd be willing to be the secretary. From that meeting, a plan began to take shape. Marcus proposed compiling a list of all the victims, holding public hearings, and inviting the press to witness. Elise would lead the charge not as a victim, but as an initiator. That evening, when Elise returned home, she received a strange call. A deep, calm male voice. "Ms. Monroe, I'm an internal affairs officer with the police department, anonymous. I have documents proving that illegal bonuses were paid to Officer Coleman from a secret fund I want to meet." Elise sat up straight. "When? Right now, send me a safe address." She sent the coordinates of a small, obscure coffee shop. An hour later, the man walked in, middle-aged, casually dressed. He placed a USB drive in front of her, his eyes worried. "I can't keep it any longer. The system will know I've seen enough." Elise thanked him, then, that night, forwarded the file to Marcus Dean's legal team. The next morning, evidence leaked to the press. Thousands of dollars that had been billed as maintenance fees were actually bounties for undocumented arrests. A storm of publicity erupted. On national television, Elise was invited to speak. She looked straight into the camera, speaking in a calm but uncompromising voice. "I'm not fighting for an apology. I'm fighting so that no one else has to bow their head when they walk into a store, when they walk down the street, when they call 911. I'm fighting so that every citizen, regardless of color, is treated as a human being." Millions watched. Social media exploded with the hashtags "Stand with Elise," "Justice," "Rising." We Are Not Invisible Victims groups from other cities began reaching out, wanting to replicate the model that Elise and the Savannah community were creating. Marcus Dean hosted an open house where Elise officially announced the formation of the Savannah Local Civil Rights Coalition. In her opening remarks, she said, "We were once divided by fear, but now the truth unites us, and when the truth speaks, no one can silence it." The hall erupted in applause. A young woman hugged Elise. "You make me believe that my mother's dream of a just world was not impossible." Elise had not only changed the city, she had awakened a generation. But she knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead, and with every step she remembered that first night, handcuffed in the middle of the pharmacy. And she had not bowed her head. That was where the storm began. And now the storm had become a movement. At the end of this section, Elise stood on the roof of a building overlooking the city, where lights illuminated every corner. She sighed, exhausted, but at peace. "A gentle breeze blew," she said softly. "Now it's their turn to be afraid." And she turned back inside where her colleagues were waiting, ready for the next step, how to turn the movement into law, into policy, into a legacy. And Elise Monroe, a woman who was once dismissed, once silenced, is now rewriting the entire rules of the game. This fight has gone beyond one individual. It has become a wake-up call for America. Savannah was in a quiet, hot, waiting summer. But the real storm did not come from the sky. It came from the news, from public meetings, from hearings, where each testimony was like a knife, cutting deep into the mask of power. Elise Monroe, now more than a symbol. She was the leader of a wave of prosecution, where the law collided directly with the fire of anger, the fire of truth, and the fire of those who had been burned by injustice. After the conference announcing the Savannah Civil Rights Coalition, Elise and her group began the most difficult phase, turning social pressure into institutional change. The first thing they aimed at was the city council, the place that approves budgets, policies, and appoints law enforcement positions. But this is also a place surrounded by tangled relationships, debt, and conditional silence. Marcus Dean made the first proposal, the creation of an independent community oversight board with access to internal records, oversight of internal investigations, and the power to recommend prosecution. Immediately, a chorus of voices on the council objected. They called it administrative interference. But Elise did not back down. She stood in the middle of the meeting room, her eyes calm, but her words cutting through the air like a knife. "We are not here to play politics. We are here to clean the blood off the hands of those who let it drip in silence." The atmosphere in the council room froze. Several councilors looked down at the table, avoiding her gaze. An older man, City Councilman James Rutherford, laughed contemptuously. "Who do you think you are to change the system?" Elise simply responded, "I am the person the system has targeted and failed." Outside, a crowd gathered in front of City Hall carrying posters, microphones, and live streams. Elise's words were broadcast live, spreading like wildfire. Within 2 hours, her video of her rebuttal to James Rutherford had been viewed more than 1 million times. That night, Rutherford's office received thousands of calls of protest, but it also made Elise a more obvious target than ever. The next day, the papers reported Elise was being sued for slandering a public official, the man behind the lawsuit, a businessman with financial ties to Rutherford himself. But instead of being scared, Elise smiled at the press conference. If they think a lawsuit can put out 100 fires burning out there, they have no understanding of the anger of the people who are being trampled. Meanwhile, Marcus and his legal team dug into the budget records. They found a string of suspicious expenses, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on professional training without any actual reporting. Once again, Greaves's name appeared in the receipts. Once again, the cracks in the system appear as a map of decay. Meanwhile, Elise began holding community hearings where people could speak out with the press present and lawyers on hand. A young mother recounted how her child had been silenced for videotaping an arrest. An elderly man brought medical records that had been left in a police locker for 4 years. Each story was another brick on the road to justice. The pressure mounted. The City Council finally voted to create a community oversight board, and they lost. For the first time in Savannah's history, a civilian agency with real oversight of law enforcement had been established. Elise didn't celebrate. She knew this was just a small check in a maze of traps, because at that moment a warning came from an old friend of her father's, a former federal agent, Elise. "You've reached a level of power they won't let anyone else touch," he said. "Get ready." And he wasn't wrong. 2 days later, Elise discovered that her alarm system had been disabled. One night, she heard a car pull up outside at 3 a.m. There was no one there. Nothing was there. But she knew. It was a warning. Informal, indirect, but clear. Isaac Monroe, her father, returned from D.C. that same week. He didn't say much, but he stayed. And he brought with him a group of old friends, former FBI, CIA, Black Power fighters. Elise knew this was no longer a local movement. This was a battlefield. At the end of Season 7, Elise attended a closed-door hearing in the state legislature. She presented her findings, presented her evidence, and proposed a model of civilian police oversight for the entire state. An old gray-haired senator asked her, "Why don't you just stay silent like everyone else?" She looked straight at him. "Because I survived this system, and I will not let it continue to trample on those who have no voice." The hearing ended. Elise walked out into the hallway, where the afternoon sun beat down on the old stone walls of the Capitol building. She didn't know what would happen next, but she did know one thing: she had gone too far to turn back. And now the law was no longer cold words on paper. It had fire. It had a name. Elise Monroe. Savannah is no longer the same city. The fresh morning air is heavy with unanswered questions, eyes watching from behind curtains, and whispers that permeate coffee shops, churches, and hospital hallways, everyone knows Elise Monroe has tapped into something she shouldn't have, a power structure that has existed for decades, running like a heartless machine, cold and ruthless. Elise never thought of herself as a hero. She started with a wound to her flesh and soul. But as the truth began to pour out, she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back. And now the price is starting to show, not in the form of arrest warrants, but in more subtle, more dangerous games. She's being followed. Her phone is tapped. Her mother receives anonymous calls only to be silenced and hung up, and the climax came that morning, when Elise discovered that the car she used every day had been tampered with, the brake lines cleverly cut. She sat in the car, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the steering wheel. If it hadn't been for the mechanic she knew who had spotted it, she might not have lived to tell what was happening. Elise didn't cry, but that night she sat in her office looking at an old photo of her mother, who died of cancer when Elise was 19, and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't know it would go this far." But the next day, Elise stood in front of the local government building, microphone in hand, her voice unshaken. "People ask me, are you scared? Yes, I am. But I'm more scared that one day my daughter will grow up and ask, 'What did you do when you saw injustice?' And I have nothing to say." Those words spread like wildfire through social media, shared millions of times. But that also made the other party unable to sit still. And then the call came from a character Elise did not expect, the mayor of Savannah. That man, experienced having overcome many political scandals, invited her to a private lunch. The location was a fancy restaurant. No cameras, no press. When she walked in, he was waiting, holding a glass of wine in his hand, as if this was just a meeting between two old friends. But what he said made Elise speechless. "You can be part of the system. As long as you stop digging. You are young. You have a future. You can be on the council. You can be in the state legislature. Don't waste it on losing battles." Elise put down her napkin and stood up. She looked him straight in the eye, a small smile on her face, but her eyes were as cold as steel. "You're wrong. I don't need to sit in a chair of power to know what's right and what's wrong. And if you're so afraid of the truth that you have to bribe me, then maybe you should be the one worrying about your future." She walked out of the restaurant, and from that day on, things accelerated. The classified documents that Marcus and his team had collected began to be presented in internal hearings. A nearly 300-page report, including unaccounted-for budgets, photos of improper arrests, forged documents, was submitted by Elise and Marcus to the Georgia Judicial Commission. The system's response was clear. They launched a counterattack. A local television news report described Elise as a disruptor. A sensational article even implied that she had links to extremist groups. At the same time, her bank accounts were randomly audited by the IRS. Her personal documents were leaked online, medical records, college photos, all in an attempt to defame and discourage Elise. But Elise was not alone. Her father, Isaac Monroe, spoke out publicly. In a live interview, he said, "If you think you can break Elise by playing dirty, you forget she grew up in the dark and she knows how to light a fire." At that point, public opinion began to split. One side thought Elise was too reckless disrupting a system that was working well. But the other side, the hurt, the ignored, the voiceless, began to rise up. They called it the Monroe Wave. They organized peaceful protests meetings to share their experiences of abuse, candlelight vigils outside City Hall with the slogan, "We see Elise. We are Elise." One night, Elise received a mysterious package in the mail. Inside the box was a file marked Top Secret, containing the internal investigation report from 6 years ago into the fatal police shooting of an unarmed black man. The case had been declared self-defense, but the file said otherwise. The man was tied up, beaten, and then shot. Elise was stunned. She knew that someone in the system was secretly on her side, someone who had witnessed it, or felt remorse, or both. But that also meant time was running out. She had to bring it all to light before those in the shadows could extinguish her last hope. She decided to hold a press conference, this time not in a hall or a church, but in front of the Savannah Police Headquarters. The press conference was live-streamed nationwide. Elise held the file in her hand, her voice unwavering. This is the truth they've been hiding. This is the blood that's been swept under the carpet, and this is where we have to choose stay silent or speak up, or everything exploded. The state legislature convened. The federal Justice Department stepped in. Other cities began reviewing their own internal procedures. And Elise, she entered history not as a politician, not as a symbol, but as a firebrand. As the night fell after the press conference, Elise sat alone in her living room. Isaac walked in, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. They won't let you go. You know that. Elise nodded her eyes, looking far away. I know, but now I won't let them go either. That night, Savannah was not as quiet as usual. The wind picked up. The streetlights flickered a sign of something bigger coming. Elise looked out the window. Outside, a city was awakening. Inside, she was a determination that could not be extinguished, because the price of truth, no matter how great, was worth more than silence. Savannah, on a late autumn morning, looked different, not because of the fallen leaves underfoot, but because of the way people looked at each other. The way a smile was barely audible, or a nod just above the shoulder that said, "We saw it." Elise Monroe sat on the steps of the federal courthouse before a crowd that was too large to count next to her father Isaac Monroe, and the team of lawyers who had accompanied her since the beginning, a crowd that was no longer just a case, but a movement, a response from the people. We no longer accept it. The public trial, with the participation of press representatives, human rights observers, and ordinary people, was not just a trial of two police officers, Rick Greaves and Julian Price, but a trial of an entire system. As the prosecutor stepped forward, reading the names of the victims, the girl arrested for making a video, the old man wrongly prosecuted, the teenager suppressed for no reason. Elise felt her heart tighten. She was more than a witness. She was the spark that started the movement. Greaves and Price could not speak in the face of the evidence that was clear as day, the body cam video, the doctored records, the forged signatures. The silence on their faces was not stubbornness, but despair. The moment the verdict was read, guilty, 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 applause filled the auditorium. Many people shed tears, not because of gloating, but because this time the system had listened. Outside, people stood waiting for news, many hugging each other and sobbing. In their hands, signs that had yellowed over the years: justice for Elise. We deserve protection. This is no longer silence. Elise didn't leave right away. She stopped at the front steps, looking down at the ground, worn by the footsteps of countless judges of countless injustices buried. Then she looked up at the sky. The blue sky of Savannah, for a brief moment, seemed to smile at her. That night, Elise returned to her small house, without guards or high fences. She turned off the lights and opened the windows. Outside on the corner of the street, a soft, singing voice echoed. Someone was humming, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around," listening. Elise remembered what her mother had whispered when she was pushed out of a women's meeting years ago. You don't have to answer to anyone. You just have to face yourself. And today she knew she had done it. Savannah would still have windy days, wrongful arrests hearings that weren't televised. But now the system knew there were people like Elise Monroe, and the system would think twice before trampling on those who seemed weak. When Elise picked up the phone, it already had a message from Marcus. "Congratulations, you changed history." She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window where the streetlights were blinking again. She knew the war wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, Elise allowed herself to be tired. Let go of the pressure. Let go of the hatred. Because now she knew the greatest thing a woman can do is not to be silent, and never to turn back. A few weeks after the trial, the state's largest newspaper ran an editorial headlined, "The Woman Who Made the System Listen." Colleges began inviting Elise to speak at conferences. A group of Atlanta high school students wrote her a handwritten letter. "You made me believe I could stand up too." A nonprofit was formed, Voice of Elise, to support victims of abuse and create community education programs on civil rights. Elise, tired as she was, attended the launch, delivering a brief but poignant speech. "I am not a hero. I am proof that silence is no longer an option." One winter morning, as she walked into her favorite coffee shop, she was greeted with a gentle gaze from the barista Elise. "Today, we treat you," she smiled, accepted a hot cup of coffee, and sat down by the window. An older woman approached and gently took her hand. "Thank you for not backing down. Thanks to you, my niece dared to report her case today." Elise said nothing. She just nodded, her eyes moist. Because sometimes justice does not ring out with the sound of a hammer, but with whispers like that, the last echoes of awakening. We have just witnessed a story that no one should have to go through. A mother, a retired nurse, an upstanding citizen, handcuffed in front of a crowd, humiliated not because of her actions, but because of the color of her skin. Elise Monroe had done nothing wrong. She just wanted her prescription back. But because of old prejudices and the toxic effects of unaccountable power, she was labeled a fraud. There is no excuse for two white police officers treating her as if she were not human. No apology, no fact-checking. Just cold, hard attitudes and the deadly silence of those who stood by and did nothing. And that is what should make us angry. Not just because Elise was arrested, but because if it weren't for a father, a former FBI agent like Isaac Monroe, this case would have been buried. Perhaps Elise will become just another number, a nameless statistic in the history of racism in America. And if you think this is an isolated incident, think again. How many people don't have a father like Isaac standing behind them? How many people are wrongfully detained without anyone filming? How many videos are deleted? How much evidence is covered up? The biggest lesson from this story is don't be silent. Silence is complicity. Indifference is a form of violence, and justice doesn't come without demand. Elise didn't just stand up for herself. She stood up for all those who didn't have a voice, and she won. But the price of that victory was tears, humiliation, and an old age dragged through a broken system. Today, when you turn off your screen, I hope you take one thing with you. Never think it can't happen to you. Don't think that because you live in a quiet neighborhood, because you're a nice person, you're safe. Discrimination doesn't need a reason. It just takes a look of prejudice and someone who doesn't dare say no. And if you feel angry, if your heart sinks when you see Elise handcuffed like a criminal, take action. Hit that like button to let Elise know she's not alone. Leave a comment to share your thoughts. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on real stories of justice, courage, and ordinary people changing the system. Because voices like Elise's need to be heard. And you can be the one to carry that voice further. We can't change the world overnight, but we can change the way it treats people like Elise. One story. One stand, one share,